So you've got yourself a gigantic shoebox of flesh and blood cards. What are you gonna do? Let's just jam all those cards together, take them down to our local game store, and see how we get on. What's that you say? You're gonna lose all your games? Well, that's because I didn't partake in one of the fundamental skills of flesh and blood, deck building. In today's video, we're gonna take a look at 5 tips to improve your deck building in flesh and blood. Anyways, before we get into the video, please consider subscribing to this channel. I make all kinds of videos on this channel, including deck discussions, flesh and blood news, help for new players. If you like flesh and blood, then please consider subscribing. Anyways, let's get into the video. So the first tip is to stick to your strategy. Once you find a hero that you like, you can then go ahead and think about what you actually want your deck to do. This sounds like a pretty simple thing. You'll go,
hey, I want to play Starvo, so I'm just gonna bonk with my big hammer.
Well, you gotta make it a bit more focused than that. You gotta look and think to yourself, what actual mechanics can my hero perform, and what can I do to make sure that I stick to that mechanic more than anything else? So, for example, let's take a look at Dash. Let's say that you really like going wide and you want to build a boost deck. A very good practical tip is to go on FabTCG and start building a deck for Dash. Once you're there, use the filters to search for the word boost. Remember, the search bar in FabTCG doesn't only search for names of cards, but also searches the card text themselves. By searching for boost, you're immediately narrowing down all the cards that either have boost or give you a reward for boosting. By doing this, you're sticking to your strategy and ensuring that your boost fires every time and that you get maximum rewards for doing so. The other side of that coin is if you started including, say, too many generics in the deck, which means that your boosts could potentially fail, or you start including too many items in your deck that don't immediately reward you for boosting. Now, the fun part of deck building is that there are exceptions to this rule, so don't take it as a hard and fast rule you have to stick to. There are times whenever including cards that might not directly benefit your strategy will actually give you a better upside than downside, but for the core fundamentals of the deck, I recommend sticking to your strategy as close as possible. Doing one thing extremely well is better than doing 2 things badly. Next up is to check generics. One of the mistakes I made very early on in my flesh and blood journey was not taking a look at the generic cards. Essentially, I just thought, pah! Generics? Rubbish! They're just there for draft, except the majestic ones, which are just there to take all my money. But it turns out that some generics are actually better at promoting your strategy of your deck than class cards themselves. For example, recently I put a deck tech video up where I placed top 8 in a road to nationals using Azalea. Now, the key component of that deck for me wasn't the arrows or the power-ups. Those were great and they were the core strategy of the deck. However, the key card that allowed that deck to function consistently was actually a generic from Monarch, a card that is not a ranger card from a set that did not include a ranger. There is a full explanation in the deck tech, however. Just for recap, Azalea has an ability that allows you to swap her arsenal for the top card of her deck. If it's an arrow, it gains dominate. So essentially, I wanted to exploit that as much as possible and make sure that I'm always finding arrows. The downside is if you do that and you whiff and don't find an arrow, you've essentially just kind of borked in front of your friends. However, Memorial Ground is an instant that allows you to put an attack action card from your graveyard on top of your deck. By playing this card, you can ensure that you can cycle good arrows every single time and get the dominate applied to them through Azalea's ability. Again, a generic that did a better job of forwarding Azalea's strategy than any of the ranger cards released so far. So you've put together a fantastic deck. It is fine-tuned to its strategy. You've got some generics sprinkled on there that no one's going to expect. What do you do next? Make sure to check your resource counts. The third tip here is probably the most important, I would say, because you could put together the best deck. However, if you don't have the resources to pay for it, you could end up drawing too many hands that are too expensive for you to play. FabTCG has a handy little curve graph thing at the side that I recently learned how to read because it's so useful, and you should too. It essentially breaks down the reds, yellows, and blues in your deck and allows you to very quickly use some fancy multiplication and figure out whether or not your deck presents enough resources to pay for the actual resource costs of all the cards in the deck. This can sometimes get a bit tricky whenever you're looking at decks like Kano, who has a hero ability that you'll constantly be paying for. Make sure to take this into account whenever you're building your decks, because you don't want your hero ability sapping all of the resources that you have finally calculated for the rest of your deck. So a little tip from me, this is just sort of a personal like 3.5 tip, is that I always try to include slightly more resources because you never know whenever you might need them. It's not down to actually having the exact number of resources because we are playing a random trading card game, and so we're going to be drawing random hands. Having an average correct resource number does not mean you're going to draw the average every time, so I like to push the average slightly higher to make sure that I get enough resources to pay for my hand. Anyways, on to the fourth point I have on my list. That's right, I took notes for this video, and that is to test using online tools. So personally, for my rudimentary deck testing, I use FabTCG. FabTCG is a fantastic on-demand flesh and blood gameplay tool that you can play games of flesh and blood in your browser against an AI. Once you import your deck from FabDB into FabTCG, you can go ahead and play against essentially any of the AI bots that they have in there. One of the things that I like to do is try and play against heroes that are in my local meta. However, they will never be as smart as some of the players that you'll come up against.
So if they're not as smart as players, why are you playing against them, Ragamuffin man? Don't you want a challenge?
Well, the purpose of this early playtesting isn't to actually challenge myself to start winning games. However, it's just to see what drawing hands feels like. Many times I've put together decks and went onto FabTCG only to find out that I don't draw enough resources, or sometimes I draw too many. I realized I was drawing too many non-attack actions instead of attack actions. Essentially what this allows me to do is figure out my ratios and see what playing an average game feels like. Because the AIs I would say are medium difficulty, it allows me a few whiff turns to actually figure out what I'm doing and finally tune the deck. This for me is one of the best playtesting points because I can do it at any time. At 3 in the morning I can fire up a browser window and just start testing a brand new deck. And for me, this is the point where the deck actually goes from the building to the improving process, because it's the first piece of feedback I'm actually getting on a build. So yeah, FabTCG, my goodness, the AI bots are just so useful. The final point for improving your deck building in Flesh and Blood is to know the meta. Now, this does have different implications for Blitz or Classic Constructed. However, knowing the meta that you're going to be playing in is extremely useful when it comes to card choices. So in Classic Constructed, this could mean putting in sideboard cards against heroes that you're more than likely going to come up against. For example, we're currently going into skirmish season, and I can probably say without a shadow of a doubt I'm going to be playing a lot of Fae, I'm probably going to be playing a lot of Kasai, and I'm probably going to be playing a little sprinkling of Icelander in there. So what I have to do is make sure that the Blitz deck that I'm building has a few cards in here to help me in those specific matchups. In Blitz, space is way more limited. You will essentially have to draw these cards against heroes that aren't the reason why those cards are in there. However, if those players are strong enough in your local meta, then it might be worth including them. Since you have up to 11 pieces of equipment in Blitz, you may as well round out your equipment with extra null rune or extra gear that'll help you in those specific matchups as well. However, knowing the meta is something that is a key, crucial component of building a Classic Constructed deck, because you have a sideboard. So sideboarding against the top heroes actually allows you to create a deck pretty much on the fly that is fine-tuned to the heroes you're going to be playing against. For example, if you're going up against a lot of Guardians, you might want to put some very large defense reactions in there. If you're going up against Wizards, you might want to put some Spell Void or some extra Null Rune in there. Essentially, by taking a look at the heroes that you're most likely to play against, you can fine-tune your deck to work best in those scenarios. I find one of the best ways of getting a feel for what the meta is like is to join local discords from the countries or cities or shops that you're actually going to be playing in. From there, you can see the discussions that players are having surrounding decks that they might be playing, as well as getting to know the people you're actually going to be playing against, which will ultimately make your day way more fun. If you're playing in a large tournament such as a Pro Tour or the Calling, it might be worth taking a look on YouTube for some of the best performing decks at the moment. There are tons of creators out there who do tier lists as well as news on which decks are actually winning tournaments, and so with that you can see what decks people are actually playing on a large scale and then tailor your deck accordingly. One really good example of this were the guys from Arsenal Pass who put together a Kano build, took it to the Pro Tour and performed fantastically. Not a lot of people were expecting Kano, but it turned out that it was a fantastic meta call that performed so well for them at that tournament. Anyway, that is 5 tips to improve your Flesh and Blood deck building experience. If you have any tips for new players, then make sure to leave them down in the comments below, or if you want to talk to me directly and the YouTube comment section isn't your thing, I'm very active over on Twitter where I'm always talking about Flesh and Blood. If you want to support the channel directly, then hop on over to my Patreon at patreon.com/theragamuffin. And if you want to get involved in some Flesh and Blood discussion, then feel free to join the Discord in the link in the description. Anyways, thanks for watching this video, and I'll see you guys next time.